Prince Edward, the Duke of Edinburgh, a title held, of course, by his late father, Prince Philip, for more than 70 years. It had been the late Prince's wish for Prince Edward to be granted the dukedom after
Prince Edward stood quietly, where louder royals usually command attention, but this time, silence may have carried the sharpest message in the palace. Behind the polished smiles, historic jewels, and carefully arranged seats, whispers are growing about a brooch, a coronation, and Camilla's place beside William's future crown. Nothing was announced, yet everything felt intentional. Did Edward just block a move the palace wanted hidden? So, do you believe Prince Edward is protecting William's future reign, or is this just a palace rumor? Let us know in the comments and subscribe so more people can uncover the real story behind royal power moves. The man they forgot to watch. For decades, Prince Edward existed in a space few noticed, and even fewer questioned. While the spotlight chased controversy surrounding Prince Andrew and followed Prince Harry's dramatic departure from royal life, Edward remained fixed in place, steady, predictable, and almost invisible. As King Charles III moved carefully through years of preparation before ascending the throne, Edward's role never changed. He showed up, fulfilled his duties, and left without leaving an impression loud enough to dominate headlines. That invisibility was never accidental. It was structural. As the youngest child of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, Edward was never positioned to lead, never prepared for central authority, and never treated as a figure whose decisions would shape the monarchy's future. By 2026, his placement as 15th in the line of succession confirmed that reality. He was not just the spare, he was the reserve behind the spare. A presence meant to exist without expectation. And yet, something began to shift between 2025 and 2026. Not in a way that could be announced or easily defined, but in a way that could be observed if you were paying attention. During 2025, while other members of the royal family faced public scrutiny and private tension, Edward and Sophie, now the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh, took on a series of solo international tours. These were not symbolic gestures. They were deliberate acts of positioning. Each appearance reinforced their loyalty to King Charles while simultaneously expanding their visibility as independent representatives of the monarchy. In a system where perception carries weight equal to authority, those actions mattered. Public response reflected it. Polling data showed that approximately 50 to 51% of British citizens viewed Edward and Sophie favorably. At the same time, only 19% and 12% respectively held unfavorable opinions of them. These were not just stable numbers. They were strong ones. And the contrast became more pronounced when placed alongside Queen Camilla's shifting public perception. Her approval rating dropped to 42%. The lowest recorded by YouGov since March 2021, while negative sentiment rose to 45%. That gap, subtle at first glance, carried implications that extended beyond public opinion. Because in the monarchy, numbers translate into influence. For a man who had spent 3 decades being overlooked, Edward was now operating from a position of growing public goodwill, one that quietly exceeded that of the Queen herself. And then came the adjustments. They weren't dramatic. There were no declarations, no visible confrontations. Instead, there were small shifts. Engagements declined, schedules rearranged, appearances made in places where absence had previously gone unnoticed. He began to show up at events where Camilla's inner circle was not present, creating a pattern that was difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Inside the palace, those patterns don't go unnoticed. Because within the carefully controlled structure of royal life, nothing is random. Every gesture, every movement, every absence carries meaning. When someone who has always followed the script begins to alter it even slightly, it becomes a signal. And when that signal comes from someone who has spent decades saying nothing, it carries weight far beyond words. But while Edward's influence grew quietly through presence and restraint, Camilla was sending signals that were far more visible and impossible to ignore. Were these symbols merely tradition or a calculated move to reinforce her position within the monarchy? Let's find out. The language of power. No one says out loud. If Prince Edward's movements were subtle, Queen Camilla's signals were visible, but no less calculated. Inside the monarchy, power is rarely expressed directly. Instead, it is communicated through symbols, details, and choices that appear small but are anything but accidental. Among those, jewelry holds a unique place, particularly brooches, which are not worn casually, but selected with precision. They are not decoration, they are statements. Justin Daughters, managing director at Berganza, has made that distinction clear in his analysis. Brooches stand apart from all other royal jewels because they are controlled, intentional, and deeply symbolic. Unlike necklaces or earrings which frame appearance, brooches frame meaning. Positioned near the heart, they carry messages tied to loyalty, authority, remembrance, and duty. And in early 2023, one such message stood out. During a period already marked by tension, ongoing fallout from the Andrew affair, and rising focus on Prince William's future succession, Camilla appeared wearing a brooch that immediately drew attention. The piece, first seen publicly in early 2023, is widely believed to have been a personal gift from King Charles in the lead-up to their coronation. Its design made its purpose unmistakable. In February 2023, she wore a brooch crafted in the shape of the Tudor crown, a silver structure embedded with sapphires, rubies, and emeralds. The Tudor crown is not just a decorative emblem. It is central to King Charles III's official cipher, carrying historical significance that traces back to the era of King George V, Charles's grandfather. Its reappearance was not coincidental. By fastening that symbol to her chest, Camilla was doing more than completing an outfit. She was displaying authority, reinforcing alignment, and placing the king's identity at the center of her own presentation. It was a visual declaration delivered without a single spoken word. But while that message was being displayed openly, Edward and Sophie responded differently. They didn't compete through symbols. They didn't counter with statements. Instead, they relied on something less visible but equally effective: presence. They appeared where consistency was needed, took on responsibilities others were expected to fulfill, and positioned themselves as the steady face of the monarchy during moments of uncertainty. Their approach did not demand attention, but it accumulated it. And in the structured language of the palace, that restraint carries meaning. As Daughters himself notes, the most powerful use of symbolism is not always the one that dominates the moment, but the one that supports it quietly, allowing its message to unfold without force. Edward and Sophie's actions function in exactly that way. Their consistency, their visibility and absence, their refusal to disrupt while still reshaping expectations, all of it operates within the same coded system that governs royal life. So when silence, presence, and symbolism begin to align, they stop being isolated gestures and start forming a visible pattern. The real question is, where does that pattern lead, and who is being placed at its center? Let's unravel what comes next. The frame before the crown. The future is no longer something the palace speaks about in distant terms. It is already shaping the present. The arrival of King William V is not a question of if, but when. And that certainty has begun to influence everything inside Buckingham Palace, from public appearances to the smallest, almost invisible decisions. Every movement now carries weight. Every absence invites interpretation, and every placement within a single photograph begins to look less accidental and more deliberate. What makes this moment unusual is not the transition itself, but how early the alignment has started. Long before any coronation is formally announced, the structure around it is already forming. The question no one asks directly, but everyone inside the royal system is answering through action, is simple. When that moment comes, who will actually be standing closest to the throne? And who will remain just outside the frame? That question sharpened during the Easter service of 2026. After an absence stretching back to 2023, Catherine, the Princess of Wales, returned beside Prince William with their 3 children. The image carried more meaning than any statement. It was not just a reappearance. It was a declaration. The Wales family, after a period shaped by illness and speculation, stood together, signaling readiness for what lies ahead. The timing reinforced that message. Weeks earlier, on February 19, 2026, the monarchy had faced renewed scrutiny, exposing vulnerabilities and raising questions about its direction. The Easter service became a controlled response, a moment that replaced uncertainty with visible unity. But it was not only about who appeared. It was about how they appeared, and more importantly, who stood where. Prince Edward, the Duke of Edinburgh, stood close to Prince William, not in the background, but within the visible structure of the future. Beside him was his son, James, the Earl of Wessex. Nearby stood Princess Anne with Sir Timothy Lawrence and Peter Phillips with his daughters and fiancé. Each presence added weight, reinforcing a pattern that felt deliberate. And then there were the absences. Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh, was expected beside Edward, yet she did not appear. The explanation pointed to illness, simple on the surface. But within the monarchy, absence rarely stands alone. It signals as much as presence. At the same time, members of Queen Camilla's circle were noticeably scattered, creating a contrast that drew quiet attention. Placed together, these details form a pattern. Edward's position, Anne's presence, the Wales family's central role, and the absence of others suggest a shift not declared, but constructed through timing and placement. Because in the monarchy, power does not announce itself. It appears in positioning, in who stands beside whom, in who is included and who is not. And right now, those who matter are already standing exactly where they need to be. But when placement, absence, and consistency begin to align this precisely, they stop looking coincidental and start revealing intent. But patterns like this don't emerge on their own. Something had to shift beneath the surface to set them in motion. Let's find out. The crisis that changed everything. What appears as a quiet rise is the result of something far louder that unfolded behind the scenes. To understand why Prince Edward's position has shifted so noticeably, you have to look at the moment the balance inside the royal family broke and how it forced a redistribution of responsibility that no one openly acknowledged. Prince Andrew's downfall did more than remove a controversial figure from public life. It created a vacuum inside the monarchy that had to be filled. At 66, Andrew was pushed out of Royal Lodge in Windsor, the Grade II listed Georgian mansion he had occupied since 2004 with Sarah Ferguson. That move alone signaled a break, but it did not stop there. He was relocated to Wood Farm, a far more isolated residence on the Sandringham estate, marking a shift from prominence to distance. Then came the formal blow. In October, King Charles III stripped Andrew of his titles, cementing his fall from grace and reinforcing the message that there was no return to his previous standing. What followed was not just personal consequence. It disrupted the internal rhythm of the family itself. That disruption reached Edward directly. Plans that had once been routine suddenly collapsed. Edward and Sophie, the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh, had arranged to spend their Easter holiday at Wood Farm, a long-standing tradition tied to the family's private calendar. But Andrew's continued presence there made that impossible. The visit was cancelled, and what had once been predictable became uncertain. Yet, the response that followed is where everything begins to change. Edward did not react publicly. There were no statements, no complaints, no attempt to reshape the narrative in his favor. Instead, something far more revealing happened quietly. Reports indicated that Edward was the first senior royal to visit Andrew after his arrest in February on suspicion of misconduct in a public office. At that moment, even King Charles, who was just a mile away at Sandringham, chose not to meet his brother. Edward did. But the purpose of that visit was not sympathy. It was a resolution. He reportedly encouraged Andrew to accelerate his departure from Wood Farm, addressing the issue directly rather than allowing it to linger. That single action revealed something important. Edward was not avoiding the crisis, and he was not exploiting it either. He was managing it. That approach defined everything that followed. While public attention remained fixed on scandal and consequence, Edward operated within the situation, absorbing pressure and preserving structure. When the king released the honors list in April 2024, something else quietly reinforced the pattern. Names like Queen Camilla, Prince William, and Princess Catherine appeared as expected, but Edward and Sophie were absent. The omission stood out. By that point, they had taken on increased responsibilities, stepping into roles that became necessary after King Charles reduced his schedule following his cancer diagnosis. They were doing more work, maintaining visibility and supporting the institution during a difficult period, yet recognition did not follow. Still, nothing changed in how they operated. They continued without adjustment, maintaining the same steady pace that had defined them for years. And in a system where loyalty is measured over time, that consistency does not fade. It accumulates, quietly, reshaping where power rests. So when consistency holds under pressure, it stops being routine and starts becoming influence. The real question is, how does that quiet accumulation translate beyond the palace walls? And what happens when public perception begins to reflect it? Let's find out. The numbers behind the silence. What looks like ceremony on the surface is driven by something far more calculated underneath. Public opinion. In a constitutional monarchy, perception is not just image. It is leverage, the kind that quietly shapes influence, access, and long-term positioning. And right now, the numbers are telling a story that the palace cannot fully control. Queen Camilla's standing has shifted in a way that cannot be ignored. Recent YouGov data places her favorability at 42%, the lowest point recorded since March 2021. At the same time, negative perception has climbed to 45%, creating a reversal that changes the balance entirely. More people now view her unfavorably than those who support her, a detail that carries weight far beyond polling charts. Set that beside King Charles III, whose approval remains strong. Around 60% of the British public hold a positive view of him, nearly double the 31% who see him negatively. That contrast alone establishes a divide. But it becomes even more striking when another figure is introduced into the equation. Roughly half of the British public view Edward and his wife Sophie favorably, while only 19% and 12% respectively hold negative opinions of them. Those numbers place Edward in a position where his net approval surpasses Camilla's by a considerable margin. In practical terms, that difference translates into something tangible. Public support becomes a form of political capital, and within the royal structure, that capital determines how freely one can operate, which makes the current imbalance difficult to overlook. Because while the palace continues to project unity, the details beneath that image tell a different story. Consider the Commonwealth Day service. On the surface, it was another carefully arranged appearance meant to reinforce continuity. Princess Anne stood out in a striking red Shibomi grace coat with a matching scarf, her presence deliberate and composed. Prince William attended as expected but noticeably alone. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, was absent, reportedly due to a private engagement. Individually, these details are easy to dismiss. Together they form a pattern. Moments where a unified front is expected but doesn't fully materialize have become more frequent. The same subtle inconsistencies appeared at Easter in day-to-day engagements and in the small gaps that begin to show when coordination isn't perfectly aligned. The palace's communication strategy continues to emphasize togetherness. Yet these repeated deviations suggest something less stable beneath the surface. And within that shifting dynamic, Camilla's position becomes more complex. Her path into the royal family was never straightforward. She entered as an outsider, navigating decades of resistance before eventually securing her place beside the king. That journey required persistence, and in many ways she succeeded. But acceptance is not the same as stability, and the foundation supporting her role appears less secure than before. What makes this moment particularly significant is what isn't driving it. This isn't the result of external shocks like Prince Harry's memoir or the fallout surrounding Prince Andrew. Those events created disruption, but they are not the force reshaping the current balance. Instead, the shift is coming from something quieter, a steady presence that does not demand attention but gradually draws it. Edward has not positioned himself through statements or confrontation. He has done it through consistency, visibility, and timing, appearing where needed, remaining reliable when others fluctuate, and allowing public perception to build without interference. And when influence builds without chasing attention, silence itself begins to carry weight. The real shift isn't always in who steps forward, but in who deliberately steps back, and why those absences begin to speak louder than presence.
Stay tuned to find out.
When not showing up becomes the statement, the moment that sparked the loudest whispers inside royal circles wasn't a speech, a gesture, or even a public disagreement. It was an absence. Easter 2026 arrived with its usual expectations, carefully planned appearances, and predictable formations. Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh, was expected to stand beside her husband, Prince Edward, completing the image of stability that had defined them for years. But at the last minute, she didn't appear. The explanation came quickly. Royal editor Rebecca English reported she was simply feeling unwell. On the surface, it was a minor detail, the kind that rarely carries weight beyond the moment. But in the world of palace optics, where timing is everything, even a single absence demands closer attention. Because it wasn't just one. A few weeks earlier, both Sophie and Edward were missing from the Commonwealth Day service at Westminster Abbey, one of the monarchy's most visible annual events. That absence combined with her Easter no-show created a pattern that could not be ignored. Royal analysts began to question whether these gaps were truly coincidental, especially given Queen Camilla's central role at both events. Social media reacted immediately. Clips, images, and side-by-side comparisons flooded platforms with users pointing out how often Sophie's presence seemed to align or deliberately not align with Camilla's orbit. Comments ranged from curiosity to conviction, with many suggesting that these were not random disruptions, but carefully calculated decisions. Some described it as quiet distancing, while others framed it as a subtle but unmistakable shift in allegiance. And yet, when Sophie does appear, the contrast is striking. Her presence is never casual. At previous Commonwealth Day services, she arrived impeccably styled in a tailored coat dress by Susanna London, paired with a Jane Taylor hat and a Sophie Habsburg clutch. Every detail refined, every placement intentional. She doesn't just attend, she positions herself. That precision matters because Sophie is not stepping away from royal life. She is choosing how to engage with it. Her appearances are selective, her absences deliberate, and her positioning always aligned with a broader strategy that extends beyond individual events. Inside palace politics, that kind of control is rarely accidental. Spouses within the royal structure are not passive participants. They function as partners, co-pilots shaping both perception and direction. And in this case, Sophie's movements, whether visible or not, are deeply connected to Prince Edward's evolving role. Their partnership operates as a unit. Every appearance reinforces it. Every absence strengthens it. And together they're crafting an image that doesn't fully align with the current center of power, but instead seems to lean towards something else entirely. Something just beginning to take shape beyond the present moment. But when absence repeats with precision, it stops being circumstance and starts becoming strategy. The real question is whether these choices are reactive or carefully planned moves shaping something larger beneath the surface, one decision at a time. Let's unravel what comes next. The strategy hidden in plain sight. What makes Sophie's absence more powerful than presence is not just timing, it's consistency. Across multiple high-profile events, a pattern has emerged that analysts are finding increasingly difficult to dismiss. Sophie and Edward are not withdrawing from royal duties. They are redefining how those duties are performed by stepping away from specific engagements, particularly those closely associated with Queen Camilla. They are creating space both visually and politically, and that space is being noticed online. The conversation has shifted from speculation to analysis. Royal watchers are dissecting event footage, tracking appearances, and mapping out who stands where, who appears with whom, and who is absent altogether. Hashtags tied to Easter 2026 and Commonwealth Day began trending briefly, with users pointing out how often Edward appeared aligned with Prince William's circle, while Sophie's absence seemed to remove any visual overlap with Camilla's presence. It's subtle, but it's effective. Because in the monarchy, alignment is rarely declared. It is shown. And what is being shown now suggests a deliberate repositioning. The image that Edward and Sophie are building feels less connected to the current structures surrounding Camilla and more aligned with the future centered around the Wales family. Their movements reflect a long-term calculation, one that considers not just the present hierarchy, but what comes after King Charles III's reign. This is where palace politics becomes most visible. Every appearance, every absence, every placement is part of a larger narrative being constructed over time. Edward's increasing visibility alongside Prince William, combined with Sophie's selective participation, creates a dynamic that shifts attention without demanding it. It doesn't disrupt the system. It adjusts it, and that adjustment carries weight. Their strategy is not about confrontation. It's about positioning. By choosing when to engage and when to step back, they are communicating within the silent language that governs royal life. Presence signals support. Absence signals distance. And both are equally powerful when used with precision. The partnership between Edward and Sophie makes that strategy even stronger. They operate in coordination, ensuring that their actions, whether visible or not, contribute to a consistent image. They are not reacting to events as they happen. They are shaping how those events are perceived, one decision at a time. Which raises the question that now sits just beneath the surface of every royal appearance. When the structure finally shifts and the next era begins, whose alignment will define the center of power? Because when positioning is shaped this deliberately over time, it stops being subtle and starts shaping what comes next. The real story isn't just who stands where now, but how those choices are quietly building the future. Stay tuned to find out. The quiet race toward the crown. Long before any official announcement is made, the future of the monarchy is already being shaped in small, controlled movements. Every detail, brooch symbolism, shifting approval ratings, carefully arranged appearances at Easter, and even strategic absences feeds into a single question that now sits at the center of palace thinking. What will the Windsor family look like when King Charles III is no longer on the throne? Publicly, the institution remains stable. Nearly 6 in 10 Britons still view the monarchy favorably, and about half believe it offers value and inspires pride. According to YouGov, the system itself is not under threat. But the individuals who represent it, the faces on the balcony, the figures placed closest to power, are far more fluid. Camilla's position illustrates that clearly. Her rise to queen was built over decades, but her role is not permanent. When Prince William ascends, Catherine will become queen consort, and Camilla will step back. What remains uncertain is the nature of that step. Whether she retains influence as a senior figure or fades into the background as part of a previous era. That outcome is not decided after the transition. It is being shaped right now. Prince Edward appears to understand this better than most. His approach avoids confrontation entirely. Instead of aligning himself too closely with any single figure, he has built a reputation rooted in consistency and service. In 2025, he represented both the King and the United Kingdom on key international visits, including a trip to Papua New Guinea marking the nation's 50th anniversary of independence and a joint visit to Japan with Sophie. These were not symbolic gestures. They established credibility beyond palace politics, strengthening his position within the institution itself. That distinction matters because when the transition comes, proximity to the crown will not depend on loyalty to individuals, but on demonstrated value to the monarchy as a whole. The front row at a future coronation will not be filled by those who made noise, but by those who positioned themselves correctly long before the moment arrived. Edward's strategy reflects that understanding. He has not issued statements, written memoirs, or engaged in public battles for attention. Instead, he relies on presence and at times absence to communicate alignment. He attends where it matters, steps back where necessary, and allows perception to build without interference. Even in a system built on visibility, restraint can carry its own kind of authority. And within the monarchy, where every gesture is observed and every placement interpreted, that kind of quiet positioning rarely goes unnoticed.
So, what do you think?
Has Prince Edward already positioned himself for power in the next reign while others focused on the present? We'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Also, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.